The wind carried dust like memory, slow, bitter, and unending. By noon, the desert sun had bleached the land to bone, and every creak of a wagon axle or distant caw of a vulture seemed louder than life itself. On that road, where heat shimmered off cracked earth, a lone rider came out of the haze. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered, with a long duster coat, faded by years of travel. His hat was wide-brimmed, shading eyes that didn't blink much. The horse beneath him was dark and tired, but steady, like its master. When he finally reached the crooked wooden sign that read Dust Creek, he paused a moment, scanning the small, wind-beaten town stretched before him. Dust Creek wasn't much. A dozen sun-baked buildings lined the main street, a saloon, a blacksmith's, a feed store, a church with one broken window. The sound of a hammer came from somewhere behind the forge, dull and rhythmic. Beyond that, nothing but desert rolling out toward the blue-gray ridges of the Sierra Madre. The stranger rode in slow, and the town went quiet in that way frontier towns do when a man they don't know shows up. A few faces peeked from behind curtains. A boy stopped chasing his dog. Two old men playing checkers froze mid-move. The saloon doors creaked open, and a handful of rough men spilled out laughing, loud, whiskey-tinted laughter. Their spurs clinked as they turned to look at the newcomer. "Look what the wind blew in," one said, spitting tobacco. "Big fella, ain't ya?" The stranger didn't answer. He guided his horse toward the watering trough, dismounted, and let the animal drink. His height was striking, easily a head taller than most men, built like someone who'd wrestled oxen or dug graves for a living. But his face held a strange calm, the kind that comes from years of silence. He turned toward the general store. The old shopkeeper, thin and pale, stood frozen behind the counter when the giant walked in. "Got any feed?" the man asked, voice deep, quiet, but carried weight like rolling thunder. The shopkeeper nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Fresh stock came in Tuesday. You are new around here." "Just passing through," the stranger said, setting down a few coins. His gloved hand was massive. The shopkeeper noticed the faint scar that ran across his wrist and disappeared beneath his sleeve, a mark that looked like it came from shackles long ago. Outside, a horse neighed, and someone yelled. Then the sharp sound of breaking glass. The stranger looked toward the saloon, where shouting had started a fight. A chair crashed through a window, followed by a man tumbling onto the dusty street. The saloon doors banged open again as Clay Maddox himself stepped out. Everyone in Dust Creek knew him, the gang leader who owned the sheriff, the bank, and most folks' fear. He was lean, mean, with a slick black mustache and eyes like cut glass. A golden pistol hung at his hip, custom-made, polished brighter than the sun. Inside, another man was groaning on the floor. Clay lit a cigar, took a drag, and grinned at the crowd gathering along the street. "Just keep an order," he said, his tone like a taunt. The stranger stood still by the trough, watching. Their eyes met across the street for a brief second. Clay's grin faltered, just a flicker. There was something in the giant's gaze, calm, unreadable, too steady for an ordinary drifter. But the moment passed, and Clay turned back toward the saloon, laughing again. The stranger turned toward the inn. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint smell of whiskey. A nervous young innkeeper named Ellis stood behind the desk, hands fidgeting. "Need a room," the stranger said. Ellis swallowed. "Of course, mister. How long you planning to stay?" The man looked out the window toward the desert. "Till the horse is rested." He paid in advance, more than enough. Ellis noticed his holster, though the gun itself was plain and old, like something worn too long. The way it hung low on his thigh wasn't flashy, but balanced, exact. That night, Dust Creek lay under the thin cry of coyotes and the moan of a windmill turning slow. The stranger sat on the porch of the inn, watching the empty street. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, just sat with a kind of stillness that made noise seem disrespectful. From across the street, old Martha Ellery watched him from her window, the widow who ran the laundry. She'd seen men come and go through Dust Creek for 20 years. She'd seen lawmen, preachers, soldiers, killers, but none looked like this one. His eyes weren't cruel or desperate. They were heavy, like they'd seen too much of the world and found it wanting. Next morning, He was at the blacksmith's by dawn. The smith, an old man named Barton, was struggling to lift a wagon axle when the stranger stepped in. "Need a hand?" Before Barton could answer, the man gripped the axle and hoisted it single-handedly onto the stand. The old smith just stared. "Lord Almighty," Barton muttered. "You got the strength of two men." The stranger only nodded. "Where can I wash up?" They worked side by side that day, Barton hammering, the stranger shaping iron with patient precision. He never asked for pay, just room and board for a few days. The townsfolk began whispering about the giant who didn't speak, who worked without rest, who didn't flinch when Maddox's men rode by shouting insults. By evening, he was sitting outside again, carving a piece of wood, eyes on the horizon where the sun bled red into the desert. That's when two of Maddox's gang swaggered by, their laughter sharp as knives. "Hey, big man," one called. "You fixin' to build a church or a coffin with that?" The stranger didn't answer. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The outlaw stepped closer, kicking dust toward him. The giant's eyes lifted once, slowly, steadily. "You done?" The outlaw froze a second, caught in that gaze. There was something cold there, not rage, not fear, just finality. The kind that made your skin crawl, because you knew you were 2 breaths from death. The outlaw backed off, muttering, "Ain't worth it." When they were gone, the stranger went back to carving. Later that night, thunder rolled over the plains, a rare sound in those dry lands. He dreamed of something he hadn't let himself remember in years. A boy crying, a badge glinting in sunlight, the smell of gunpowder, the echo of his own gun firing, and a young man falling in the dust. He woke before dawn, sweat on his brow, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object, a marshal's badge, old and worn. He stared at it for a long moment, then slipped it back inside and looked out the window toward the horizon again. At sunrise, he was already back at work in the forge, hammer striking steel with perfect rhythm. A small crowd gathered, men, women, even children, watching him bend hot iron like clay, every movement calm and sure. When the wheel of a rancher's cart broke, the stranger lifted the entire rear end alone, while Barton fitted the replacement. The crowd murmured, "Never seen strength like that." One whispered, "Who is he?" Another asked. No one knew, but word spread faster than the desert wind. A giant drifter had come to Dust Creek, a man too quiet to be ordinary, too calm to be harmless. By sundown, even Maddox had heard the talk. He leaned back in his chair at the saloon, a half-empty bottle on the table, grinning at the story. "A giant, huh?" he said to his men. "Maybe he's what this town needs, a little fun." The saloon at Dust Creek was louder that night than it had been in months. Piano music stumbled across sour notes as drunk laughter rolled like thunder against the walls. The smell of whiskey and sweat hung thick in the air. Men played cards with the kind of fury that comes from long weeks of boredom and fear. And in the far corner, under the low amber glow of a kerosene lamp, sat the quiet giant they'd all been whispering about, the drifter who'd lifted a wagon with his bare hands and still hadn't said a word worth remembering. He was nursing a tin cup of water. Not whiskey, not beer, just water. The piano player's rhythm faltered for a moment as he caught sight of the stranger sitting there alone, hat low, shoulders broad as a barn door. Folks had started calling him the ox behind his back, half in jest, half in awe. Then the saloon door swung open hard, and Maddox strolled in like sin wearing spurs. The room fell quiet, as if the music itself feared him. He wore a black duster, his golden pistol glinting under lamplight. Clay's grin was the kind that didn't reach his eyes, sharp, cold, deliberate. Behind him came 3 of his men, swaggering like hyenas waiting for the kill. "Well, hell," Clay said, voice slow and slick. "If it ain't the giant I've been hearing about." The drifter didn't look up. He took another slow sip of water, eyes fixed on the wooden bar ahead of him. Clay took that as invitation enough and walked closer, boots thudding heavy on the floorboards. "You don't say much, do you?" he drawled. "Tell me, Ox, how's the air up there?" Laughter rippled through the room, nervous and thin. The drifter still didn't move. The bartender, an old man with one blind eye, froze behind his counter, hands shaking as he wiped the same glass over and over. Clay leaned down close enough to smell the sweat on the stranger's neck. "You deaf, Ox? Or just stupid?" Still nothing. Just the faint sound of the wind outside pushing dust against the saloon's walls. Clay's grin widened. "I think maybe you're scared to talk in front of real men." He snatched the glass from the stranger's hand and poured the rest of the whiskey from his own bottle over the man's head. The liquid dripped down slow, catching the lantern light like amber tears. The room held its breath. The stranger's jaw tightened once, just once. His hand stayed on the table. The veins in his forearm stood out, pale against the grime of travel, but he didn't lift a finger. Clay barked a laugh. "Ain't he something, boys? Big as a mountain, quiet as a church mouse." One of the gang members, a skinny man with a scarred lip, added, "Reckon if we poke him hard enough, he might move for us." The laughter came again, louder this time, crueler. The townsfolk in the room stared at the floor, ashamed. A woman who worked the tables glanced at the drifter's face, her eyes filled with pity. She'd seen men beaten for less, seen blood splatter across the same floor where her feet now stood. Clay reached out, slow and deliberate, and flicked the brim of the giant's hat upward with one finger. Beneath it, the stranger's eyes met his, gray, cold, utterly unflinching. For a heartbeat, Clay's smirk faltered. "Go on then," he said, voice lower now, with something sharp behind it. "Say something that—" The giant's voice came out quiet, deep enough to make the lamp glass tremble. "Don't want trouble." Clay chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Trouble? Son, you're looking at it." He shoved the man's shoulder. "You're in my town. You eat our food, sleep in our beds, drink our water, and you don't so much as tip your hat when a man addresses you? That's plain rude." The drifter stood. It was like watching a shadow rise from the earth, tall, silent, the kind of presence that made the air feel heavier. He looked down at Clay without anger, only something distant, as if measuring the weight of what might come next. Clay's hand twitched toward his golden pistol, but the stranger simply stepped aside and began walking toward the door. He didn't hurry, didn't even look back. That's when one of Clay's men, the scarred one, snapped. "You turn your back on the boss, you damn fool." He drew a knife, threw it hard. Everything happened in the space between two heartbeats. The stranger's hand shot out and caught the blade midair, fingers closing around the steel like it was a falling feather. The knife stopped dead, inches from his chest. Gasps broke through the room. Even the piano player froze mid-note. The drifter looked at the blade, then at the man who threw it. His eyes were colder than the desert at night. He turned the knife in his hand once, slow, then set it on a nearby table. "No more," he said softly. Then he pushed through the saloon doors and stepped out into the night. The silence he left behind was deafening. Clay Maddox stood there, lips pressed thin, eyes dark with something ugly. Around him, his men shifted uneasily. The townsfolk went back to their drinks, pretending not to breathe. Outside, the stranger walked down the main street under a cold sliver of moonlight. The desert wind picked up, whispering over the rooftops like an old ghost. He paused near the hitching post, wiping the whiskey from his face with one gloved hand. For a moment, he looked toward the hills beyond town, where the horizon bled into darkness. Memories came unbidden. The smell of smoke. A boy's terrified eyes staring down the barrel of his gun. The crack of the shot that ended too much, too soon. That was years ago, but time hadn't dulled the sound. He remembered the dust settling over the boy's chest, the way the world seemed to stop breathing. After that day, he'd thrown his badge in the fire and sworn never to draw again. The door behind him creaked open. The woman from the saloon stepped out, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was weary, eyes kind. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. "Clay Maddox, don't take kindly to being embarrassed." He turned slightly, the lamplight catching the edge of his scar. "Wasn't looking to embarrass anyone." "He'll come for you," she said. "He always does." He nodded once. "Then he'll come." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You're not like the others. I can tell. What's your name?" He looked away toward the empty desert road. "Don't matter." The woman swallowed her words and went back inside. The stranger stood alone for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the town. A dog barking in the distance, a shutter creaking loose, the faint echo of laughter returning to the saloon. Inside, Clay slammed his fist on the table hard enough to spill drinks. "You see that? He made a damn fool out of me. Out of us." His voice was sharp with rage now. "Ain't no drifter walks out on Clay Maddox like that. You hear me?" His men nodded, uneasy. "Tomorrow," Clay said, voice low and venomous. "Before the sun's up, we're gonna make the ox crawl in the dirt. I want him begging. I want him to remember who runs Dust Creek." He leaned back in his chair, smiling again, meaner this time, eyes glittering like a snake's. Back outside, the drifter walked to the edge of town, where his horse waited. He sat down on the wooden trough, pulled a small object from his coat pocket, and turned it in his palm. The tarnished badge caught the faint starlight. U.S. Marshal. The letters were faded, but the memory burned bright. He stared at it for a long time, then tucked it away again. The wind shifted, carrying laughter from the saloon across the empty street. It mixed with the sound of the rattling shutters and the whisper of sand dragging along the ground. The wind came early that morning, dry and sharp, carrying the smell of smoke before the sun had even touched the rooftops. It was the kind of dawn that made the land feel haunted, where even the coyotes stayed silent, and the sand seemed to wait. Inside the small blacksmith shop at the edge of Dust Creek, the giant drifter sat awake, staring at the glowing embers in the forge. He hadn't slept. He'd known the laughter from the saloon wasn't finished. Men like Clay Maddox never left a thing alone. His horse shifted restlessly outside, sensing what was coming. The sky was still black, with only a thin pale line of light creeping over the eastern ridge. Then came the hoofbeats. Faint at first, then louder. 6 horses, maybe 7, moving in a line, slow and steady. The drifter rose from the bench, slipped his coat on, and reached for his hat. He didn't touch his gun. Not yet. Outside, torches burned bright in the darkness. The Clay Maddox gang rode through the street like ghosts on fire, shouting, laughing, their faces half lit by the flames. They stopped in front of the blacksmith's. Clay sat tall on his horse, golden pistol gleaming at his hip, a cigar clenched between his teeth. "Well, would you look at that?" Clay called out. "The ox still breathes." The drifter stepped out onto the porch, silent as a shadow. Clay spat into the dirt. "You embarrassed me in front of my own men. Made me look weak in my own saloon. That ain't something I let a man walk away from." Behind him, 2 men dismounted, tossed their torches into the open forge. Flames jumped instantly, licking at the walls, roaring to life. Sparks shot into the cold wind, scattering like angry stars. "Clay," the drifter said quietly, "don't do this." That voice again, low, calm, heavy with warning. Even Clay's men shifted in their saddles, uneasy. But Clay's grin stayed wide. "You think you can tell me what to do, Ox?" he said. "You got one chance to beg. Might even let you crawl out of town alive if you kiss my boots while you're at it." The drifter didn't move. The flames reflected in his gray eyes. Then Clay nodded. "Tie him up." Before he could react, 3 men jumped him at once, ropes around his arms, one across his chest, another around his neck. They dragged him forward, kicking dust. He didn't fight, didn't raise a hand. They slammed him against a hitching post, bound tight. Clay stepped closer, smirking. "Where's that strength now, Ox?" He drew the whip from his saddle and cracked it once in the air. The sound echoed through the sleeping town. Lights flickered on behind curtains. People peeked out, frightened, ashamed, pretending they couldn't see. The first strike landed across the drifter's back. The leather split his coat, drew blood. He grunted, but made no sound after that. The second blow came harder. Then a third. The men laughed as they worked. From her window across the street, Martha Ellery saw it all. The old widow's hands shook as she clutched her shawl. Her husband had been killed by Clay Maddox years ago when he refused to sell his land. She'd buried him in silence, watched the town bow to fear ever since. But seeing it again, the cruelty, the cowardice, something inside her broke. She threw open her door and stepped into the cold street, nightgown fluttering in the wind. "Stop it," she cried. Stop it, you devils. Clay turned, amused. Well now, if it ain't the preacher's widow, he said, smiling cruelly. Go back inside, old woman. This ain't your business. It's everyone's business when men do this, she shouted. Ain't you done enough killing? The townsfolk behind their curtains heard her voice tremble, but hold. Some looked down in shame. Others whispered prayers they didn't mean. Clay sneered. You got a big mouth for someone who ain't worth the dirt on her boots. He raised his hand toward her, but before he could speak again, the drifter lifted his head. His voice came out rough, quiet, but carried through the wind. Get inside, ma'am. Martha froze. His tone wasn't pleading. It was protective, gentle, but final. She backed away, tears streaking her weathered face, and whispered, Lord help you. Clay grinned wider. Oh, he'll need more than the Lord when I'm done. He tossed the whip aside and reached for his golden pistol. That's when the drifter spoke again, louder now, but still calm, like a preacher at the end of a long sermon. Son, he said, you should have stayed laughing. Clay hesitated. For one split second, something in that voice, something ancient, certain, made his hand falter. Then instinct took over, and he drew. The sound of gunfire shattered the dawn. No one saw the drifter move. One moment he was bound to the post. The next, the ropes snapped like threads. His gun cleared leather in a blur of motion, so fast it was barely human. 3 shots in the blink of an eye, sharp, clean, final. Clay's men dropped before their hands touched their triggers. Clay fired once, wild, the bullet grazing the drifter's shoulder. The next second, the golden pistol was gone, spun from his grasp by a single shot that shattered bone. Clay staggered back, clutching his hand, eyes wide. Who the hell are you? The drifter stepped forward, smoke curling from his revolver, blood running down his arm. The town was silent now, every door cracked open, every face pale in the half-light of dawn. Name's Cole Darrow, he said. Marshal. Was anyway. The name hit like thunder. Some gasped, others crossed themselves. They'd heard it before, years ago, from stories carried across the frontier. The lawman who'd cleaned out Red Hollow single-handedly. The marshal who vanished after a border massacre no one talked about. Clay's mouth fell open. You're dead, he stammered. They said you died at Canyon Ridge. Cole's eyes hardened. I did. Clay backed away, stumbling. I ain't scared of ghosts. Cole's revolver stayed steady. You should be. Clay went for the knife at his belt, but the motion never finished. The gun flashed once more, and he fell backward into the dust, staring at the sky as his last breath slipped out. The golden pistol lay beside him, half buried. The smoke drifted slowly in the pale morning light. Horses snorted nervously. The fire at the blacksmith's forge died down, leaving only blackened beams and glowing coals. Cole stood still, chest rising and falling, his shadow long against the dawn. Around him, the people of Dust Creek stepped out one by one, the innkeeper, the shopkeeper, even the old piano player, blinking like men waking from a long nightmare. Martha Ellery approached slowly, her hands trembling. She looked down at Clay's body, then at Cole. You saved us. He shook his head. Just did what needed doing. She reached out, laid a hand on his arm. You'll stay? The town could use a man like you again. Cole looked past her, toward the horizon burning orange with sunrise. No, ma'am. Law died with me once. Ain't bringing it back. She nodded, tears slipping down her face. Then go in peace, Marshal. He tipped his hat. Ma'am. As he walked away, the townsfolk gathered around the bodies, whispering his name like a prayer. Cole Darrow, the marshal who came back from the grave. He reached his horse at the edge of town and stopped for a moment, looking back. Dust Creek was quiet now. No laughter, no cruelty, just the wind and the sound of a single church bell starting to ring. He holstered his revolver, wincing as pain shot through his shoulder. The sunrise caught the badge still tucked inside his coat, glinting faintly before he closed the flap again. Dawn came soft over Dust Creek, spilling gold light over the scorched earth and broken silence. The air still smelled faintly of smoke. Clay Maddox and his men lay buried behind the saloon, their guns collected in a heap beside the well. No one said a prayer. No one argued either. When the widow Martha Ellery pressed her shovel into the ground, not a man in town dared stop her. She was the first to speak since the gunfire. "Bury them deep," she said, her voice low, "and let the desert keep what it wants." By mid-morning, the sky was clear again, the kind of clear that follows a storm. The people of Dust Creek began to move as though waking from a long dream. The bartender scrubbed blood from his doorway. The shopkeeper took down the closed sign that had hung for years. Even the church bell, long silent, rang once, just once, and the sound rolled across the valley like a sigh. The giant drifter, Cold Darrow, stood beside the blacksmith's ruins, hammering new beams into place. His shoulder was bandaged, his shirt torn and burned from the fight, but his movements were steady, deliberate. The forge was half gone, but he rebuilt it piece by piece as though he'd been born for this sort of quiet work. The rhythm of the hammer against iron was slow and even, echoing through the dusty street like a heartbeat returning to life. Children watched from a distance, whispering stories about what they'd seen. Some said he caught bullets with his hands. Others swore the fire itself bent away from him. Martha Ellery sat nearby, silent, a blanket over her knees, eyes fixed on the man who had saved them. When he finished, he brushed the soot from his coat, reached into his pocket, and placed a handful of coins on the anvil, silver dollars gleaming in the morning light. "For Barton's forge," he said quietly to no one in particular. Martha rose slowly and walked toward him. "You're leaving, ain't you?" He nodded. "Town's safe now. That's all I came for." Her gaze softened. "Safe for now. But men like Maddox, there's always another one." Cole's jaw tightened. "Then someone else will have to stand up next time." She studied him a moment, then reached out and touched his arm. "My husband used to say justice don't vanish. It just forgets where it lives for a while. Maybe you reminded it." He gave a small, almost weary smile. "Maybe." By the time the sun stood high, Cole had his horse saddled. The town gathered in small clusters, watching as he mounted up. No one spoke, not out of fear anymore but reverence. Even the wind seemed to still. A little boy broke from his mother's arms and ran after him, his bare feet kicking up dust. "Mister," he shouted. "Hey, mister." Cole turned his horse, waiting. The boy stopped, panting, his eyes wide with awe. "What's your name, mister? So we can tell folks who saved us." For a long moment, the giant said nothing. The horse snorted, pawing at the dirt. Then he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds both sorrow and peace. "Doesn't matter, kid." He tipped his hat low. "Just remember, some men don't talk, 'cause they've already said enough with their guns." The boy nodded solemnly, not understanding, but knowing somehow it was important. Cole gave a small nod back, then nudged his horse forward. He rode slow through the center of Dust Creek. The saloon stood open, its doors swaying gently. The piano player watched from the window, hat over his heart. The shopkeeper stepped onto his porch, head bowed. Even the sheriff, whose badge hadn't seen daylight in months, stood at the end of the street, touching the brim of his hat in quiet respect. Cole didn't look back again until he reached the ridge above town. From there, Dust Creek looked small, like a scar slowly healing under the rising sun. He could see the forge's smoke rising thin and straight, no longer angry, just calm. He reached into his coat and took out the marshal's badge one last time. The metal caught the sunlight, gleamed for a second, then dulled again under his thumb. He thought of the men he'd buried over the years, the ones he couldn't save, the boy he'd killed by mistake. Those ghosts would always ride with him, but for the first time in a long time, they rode quiet. He turned the badge over, then tossed it into the canyon below. It fell without a sound. The wind rose gently as if answering him. The desert stretched endless ahead, miles of open land, mesas in the distance, clouds gathering like distant sails. He took a deep breath, the kind only a free man can take, and rode toward the horizon. Behind him, Dust Creek slowly came alive. The forge smoked again. Children laughed where gunfire had once echoed. The widow's garden, untended for years, bloomed that spring for the first time. They spoke of him often in the years that followed. Some called him a ghost, others a legend. There was always someone who swore they saw him again, riding along the border, quiet, tall, alone. They said he never drew first, but he always finished last. They said his shadow stretched longer than the day itself, and his silence carried more weight than 100 sermons. But mostly, they just called him the quiet giant of Dust Creek. And in that town, long after the grave sank into the earth and new generations filled the streets, mothers told their children how justice had come once in the shape of a man who spoke little and left before the applause. Sometimes, when the wind blew hard across the desert, carrying dust through the canyons, it sounded almost like hoofbeats fading into distance. Folks would stop, listen, and swear they heard it. One man riding, coat flapping in the wind, heading toward the place where sun and earth met. They never built a statue. They didn't need to. The land remembered him better than any stone could. And so, when the last light of day touched the town's edge and the air turned gold, Dust Creek would whisper its own prayer. That legends aren't born in thunder, they're carved in silence. They're the echoes left behind after the gun smoke clears, when a man's shadow stretches over the land, and the only proof he ever lived is the peace he leaves behind. And somewhere beyond the ridge, where the sky turns red over the canyon, Cold Darrow rode on, alone, unhurried, and finally free.